Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea is facing a series of difficult questions about how its social policies should evolve in a rapidly changing society. Seoul is now considering raising the eligibility age for free subway rides from 65 to 70 for the first time in more than 4 decades, reigniting a broader debate over what it really means to be an older adult in today's Korea. Now, at the same time, negotiations over next year's minimum wage have once again missed the legal deadline as labor and business remain far apart over how to balance rising living costs with mounting pressure on employers. So what do these debates tell us about the future welfare, work, and fairness across generations? For answers to this, we connect to Shin Eun-kyung, Associate Professor of Sociology at Korea University, who's also a visiting scholar at Harvard University. A very big welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
And also joining us is Lee Hyun, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Good to see you again, Professor.
It's great to be back on the program.
So let's start a discussion right away. First with Professor Shin. Of course, like I've said, Seoul is considering raising the age for free subway rides from 65 to 70. Why has this issue come to the forefront right now?
The free ride program for the elderly has been financially bleeding for years, but the number just shockingly increased. Losses hit a record of 775 billion in 2025, and the share of the total deficit attributable to the free rides increased from 24% to 58% just in 4 years. Especially when we consider rapidly aging Seoul population, it also complicates the situation. In 2021, 16% of Seoul population was over 65. In 2025, we hit 20%, which means we can only expect more and more people become eligible for the benefit. That means ever heavier fiscal burden on the Seoul metropolitan government is inevitable. Also, from the citizens' perspective, the reaction is somewhat split. Many seniors see it as a state taking away hard-earned social rights unfairly. For the younger generation, by contrast, the question why they should finance an ever-growing benefit they won't enjoy for a decade, if at all. Also, political and policy debates emerged as well, but critics also note that age hike may be wrongful. Limiting the free rides to the bottom 70% by income would cut losses far more effectively. So some see the proposal as politically convenient measure rather than a genuine proposition for the fairness. So the tension is actually very clear. The government sees unsustainable structural cost. Citizens sees a contested question of who deserves the benefit and who should pay for it.
Right, so this debate, it's going well beyond transportation and reflects a broader demographic changes and differences in generations' perspectives as well. Now, so as this discussion moves forward, some argue that local governments have the legal authority to adjust the eligibility age, even if the national standard remains at 65. Professor Lee, from a legal perspective, how feasible is Seoul's proposal?
Right. So there's actually no specific law that sets a target, age for free subway rides. So as a result, there's no legal framework necessarily to say that you have to offer or not offer free rides for senior citizens or those who are elderly. So as a result, in terms of the law itself, really, it gives the local operators generally free rein to decide for themselves as to what the cost of ridership should be for the subway. But as we all know, though, when it comes to this proposal from Seoul, beyond just a legal issue, which really there's no legal issue there really. The real question becomes sort of network operability, because if anyone has taken the subway in the capital region, everyone knows that basically you can take a subway from Gyeonggi province to Seoul and then Seoul to Incheon. And in fact, even though for the rider himself or herself, it's very seamless, but we actually have different operators who basically can set their own fares for those lines. So for instance, we're talking about the Seoul Metro area, that's governed by, this basically by the Seoul Metro, the Metropolitan Authority. But when it comes to, let's say, the Gyeonggi lines outside of Seoul, those are mainly run by Korail. And then you have even private operators operating the Shinbundang line, right? So as a result, while Seoul City can mandate a particular fare or no fare for, let's say, elderly, when it comes to then dealing with issues of how you would then collect fares if the other operators decide not to honor that or have different rates, that will cause some sort of issues with respect to how you collect fares for those different operators because it's so seamless in terms of the rider's point of view. So in terms of legal perspective, there's really no barrier, but it really becomes a question about how the operators themselves will then manage this issue together.
Right, so it's not as just simple, so many operators could have different opinions on that as well. Now, one of the biggest concerns about the latest move is the impact on people, of course, between the ages of 65 and 69 who could lose public transport benefits. Professor Shin, how significant do you think that backlash could be, and what kind of concerns are likely to emerge?
Actually, this is a very well-studied policy question, most importantly, the health outcome. The mobility has a significant consequence for health, especially for the elderly. The mobility barriers translate directly into reduced social and physical activity, which will lead to public health concern later on. So when trends become costly again, seniors make fewer trips and cut off social visits, community activities, and non-urgent medical care, which is directly tied to well-being and health. This can accelerate social isolation, depression, and physical decline for the elders. And also, age is a blunt measure, raising the threshold to hit a low-income, young-old parties. Since the wealthier seniors can afford the fare while the poor people have to cut off their travel. For many seniors, discounted transportation is not a perk. It is a critical lifeline. It allows older adults to see their doctors, take a prescription, visit family, and stay connected to their communities instead of being isolated at home. When we lower the cost of getting around for the senior, we are not just helping one specific age group. We're investing in a society that values social connection and inclusion. So a blunt age hike may save money on paper, but creates bigger social and health costs down the line. Because of that, we may need to think targeted fixes, for example, like gradual phase-in, age tiers, income-based support, off-peak limit, and gradual discount instead of free or paid binary schemes.
But another concern about this issue is the eligibility age. If it's raised while the retirement age remains lower, Professor Lee, many could face a gap between leaving work and receiving benefits. What kind of safeguards would be needed to avoid creating such a gap?
Right, exactly. There will be a gap, and the problem is that Korea's statutory, retirement age now is 60. There's, of course, talks, and it will be raised higher, but the national pension eligibility age is currently 63 and then scheduled to rise eventually to 65 later on. And so now, because of this, as you mentioned, a gap, we have a problem because someone retires at 60, but then there's a 3-year gap or some year gap before they can actually receive their pension. And so the question then becomes, what happens to those people who need a salary but are unable to access it because their pension doesn't kick in until a later date? So that's a real issue. And the question, as you mentioned, with respect to safeguards, there has to be safeguards in place to cover those years that someone does not earn an income. And so there's been talk about various kinds of ways of dealing with this. And so one natural way is just to synchronize the dates of retirements and the pension eligibility date in terms of the age. But not just that, you can certainly do that. But another issue is if you're not willing to, let's say, adjust the retirement age, then the question then becomes, are there going to be any requirements for employers to potentially, let's say, re-employ people who are subject to retirement? And then if that happens, then there's lots of other concerns there as well, because usually someone who retires is at the highest level of income with respect to salaries, with respect to, let's say, a company or business. If you're at a senior level. So if you get rehired, the question is, are you going to be rehired at the highest level of salary that you could be earning? Or does there need to be some adjustments with respect to, let's say, your age, and then also considering younger employees who are coming into the system, right? So there's a lot of questions here in terms of how to deal with this issue, because if you're going to require people to be reemployed after they retire to cover this gap, right? There are lots of sort of downward issues down the road that you have to deal with respect to new workers, younger workers coming in, and how this is going to affect the company's bottom line, who's responsible for this in terms of salaries so that there is no gap. Does the government need to step in with some sort of government program? So this is a really important issue, because the safeguards need to be there in order to help people who are not going to have a salary for that time period before their pension actually kicks in.
Definitely. So this would suggest that any reform would be needed to be accompanied by broader policy changes on different sectors. Now, finally, so if Seoul actually moves ahead with this proposal, Professor Shin, do you think it could become a turning point for raising the age standard nationwide? And what would it take to build public consensus?
Most plausibly, yes. I mean, the subway benefit can be seen as uniquely a Seoul problem, but the subway debate is really a proxy for a much larger question that Korea is facing at the moment, whether to raise the age line of elderly itself. Currently, we are using 65 as a cutoff, but as a famous meme said, 70 is a new 50. As with the growing life expectancy, being 65 carries very different meaning now. When we first implemented this free ride program in 1984, the average life expectancy in Korea was 68.4. Now, in 2026, we have 83.5 years of life expectancy on average, 83.5. Certainly, 65 has become somewhat questionable cutoff for the elderly. But we need to be very careful, as Professor Lee mentioned, because this change will cascade into pensions, healthcare, long-term care, and other social benefits. So it's a very important moment for think about the seniority, hopefully driven not by fiscal panic, but by fairness. And yes, of course, public consensus matter on this issue, as in general, consensus is less about the actual number than about perceived fairness of the process. So I think Seoul can be set a very good example, but only it models a procedure that our citizens can trust and agree on.
We'll have to see how discussions would unfold in the moving forward. Now, let's shift to another topic. So this year's minimum wage, Professor Shin, negotiations have once again missed the legal deadline, with labor and business still apart. Beyond the numbers, what does this disagreement tell us about the challenges facing Korea's economy?
So obviously, the missed deadline is less of a technical failure than a clear symptom of a broader social insecurity. 3 points in particular are worth thinking through here. First of all, the current minimum wage deadlock in Korea reveals profound discrepancy in how different social classes experience the economy. For low-wage workers who are navigating through temporary and part-time jobs, the issue is directly related to survival and a basic claim to living wage as a social right. For many small business owners, at the same time, the same wage debate is experienced as an existential threat. So each side actually claimed the victimhood, and mostly plausible. And secondly, there is a certain irony in why we can't seem to reach an agreement on the minimum wage. It shows just how fixated we've become on the number itself. As it stands, Korea minimum wage system doesn't account for differences across regions, across industries, or across skill levels. So in a way, this deadlock is also a chance to see the underlying major problem, that we are clinging for far too rigidly to a system that simply doesn't reflect the diversity of the 21st century labor market. Overfixation on a single national number that ignores regional, sectoral, and skill differences will not solve the problem. Also, most importantly, the gap between law and reality is so wide. In Korea, about 12.5% of all wage workers are paid below the minimum wage. What's the point of agreeing on a certain number that cannot be implemented? When we look at how the minimum wage actually is implemented in practice, we can see how unrealistic the magic one number approach is. The large companies with 300 or more employees, that rate is just 2.5. But at the smallest business, those with fewer than 5 workers, it climbs up to 30 to 40%. So the violations of the minimum wage law are turning up to strikingly high in small places. And the truth is, even if everyone agrees on a like minimum wage, as long as the number doesn't reflect the reality of the economy on the ground, the underlying economic inequality will simply going to persist.
So just beyond just fixation of these numbers, implementation is another question that needs to be resolved. Now, going back to the discussion that we have, Professor Lee, labor groups are calling for a 16% increase while employers are demanding a wage freeze legally and institutionally. How is the Minimum Wage Commission expected to bridge this wide gap?
Well, let's think about the commission itself. We're talking about 27 members. 9 members represent workers, the other 9 sort of management or employers, and then you have 9 that are sort of public interest members, and they're supposed to be neutral, right? They're appointed by the government. And so this commission is supposed to deliberate and then sort of make a recommendation to the minister, who will then make an announcement as to what the minimum wage should be. Now, basically, the way it works in the commission is naturally you have the employer side and the employee side. Each side will make their sort of proposal. And as you noted here, the employee side, they want a 16% increase to raise the minimum wage to 12,000 won, whereas employers want to freeze it and keep it as it is. So basically, you have both sides, and then of course you have those 9 members who are the public interest members who are appointed by the government, and they sort of hold the tiebreaker vote, right, in this whole process. So generally speaking, they try to reach some consensus. Essentially, they go through many rounds of discussions, and last year, there was eventually a settlement among the commission members to agree on a particular minimum wage. But as it stands, in terms of where the parties are now, right? We have one calling for 16% increase and another side, the employers, saying 0%. The question is, where will they fall in between, right? And part of it is as opposed to a deliberative process, it more looks like a negotiation at some point, where the government then steps in to sort of reflect the views of the government, and then that process is worked out where then an actual minimum wage is set. So this is supposed to be generally a deliberative process, but I think we all can see that this is a negotiated sort of rate. And so depending on whether each side and how strongly each side comes forward, and whether or not there can be consensus reached, that will really be the basis by which the decision is actually made with respect to the commission. And then hopefully at some point right in August, it should be announced in terms of what the rate actually is.
So reaching common ground certainly won't be as easy as it sounds. But stepping a little bit back, Professor Lee, the minimum wage has missed the legal deadline in most years since the system has been introduced. Do you think there should be some reform regarding that?
Yeah, because this has been a 40-year sort of decision structure that's been in place, where we have this commission, and again, it generally was thought of as being a deliberative process because we have a commission. A commission is supposed to gather together, hear various reports, and then come to sort of general consensus to make a decision as to what the minimum wage should be. But it's really not a work of a commission. It's more like a negotiation. And so as a result, because you have interested parties on both the employer side and on the employee side, basically, this haggling process is what we've been seeing over the years when it comes to minimum wage. And so as a result, that's one issue that I think needs to be addressed. Is this is not really a commission, but really a negotiation. But then there's also another question about the government-appointed commissioners or the members of the commission, the public interest members, in terms of whether they're that neutral, because of course they're appointed by the government and the president. So obviously they're going to reflect potentially the views of the ruling party or the president who's in power. And so as a result, there's that element as well with respect to the work of the commission. And then, with respect to reforming the whole process, then the question becomes, where people have missed the deadline, right? As we talked about, they missed the deadline to sort of announce and get to some result with respect to deciding on the rate. Basically, these deadlines, do they have any real significance? They certainly do at one level in terms of pushing the commission to make a decision. But because it seemed to be, regularly missed, that seems to be some concern for dysfunction. And as a result, the question is there needs to be, people have called for some real change in the system to redesign the whole system in such a way that we have a more deliberative process, more fairness, more voices in the conversation, that the commission can do its work, and this wouldn't be simply a negotiation between sort of management and labor. So I think that's where a lot of the conversation has been heading so far.
Right. So it really raises an important question about whether the current system is still fit for purpose, and we'll have to see how this would evolve moving forward. But as for now, we'll have to leave our discussion right here. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Lee.
It was my pleasure.
And of course, Professor Shin, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.